In the forgotten lands, where the wind howled songs of despair across the grey hills, an old widower named Elias dragged himself along. His stooped shoulders carried not only the weight of years, but also the promise made to his deceased wife, to protect his family. Beside him, Finn, the eldest grandson, with courageous eyes and calloused hands, tried to warm little Leo, whose frail body trembled beneath a thin blanket, his dry cough tearing through the icy silence. The village, with its scorn and closed doors, had cast them out into solitude. Now, their only refuge was a ruined castle, a crown of cold, mossy stones atop the windiest hill, a place that, according to a yellowed parchment, once belonged to their ancestors. The cold stones seemed to mock their hope, and the echo of the howling wind was the only melody that greeted them in that decaying home. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, tearing through the cracks of the ruined castle. Elias, with his body bent and soul heavy, pushed the rotten wooden door, which groaned in protest before giving way. The smell of mold and cold stone invaded his nostrils, a promise of desolation. Finn, with wide eyes, held Leo tightly, his little brother's body trembling uncontrollably. The castle, once a symbol of power, was now just a stone skeleton, roofless in many parts, its walls corroded by time and oblivion. "Here, this is our home now," Elias murmured, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and despair. There was no intact fireplace, only black holes where fire had once danced. The stones, once guardians of warmth, now radiated a biting cold that seemed to penetrate their bones. Finn tried to nestle Leo against him, but the cold was relentless. Leo's cough, once sporadic, now echoed through the empty hall, stronger, wetter. The sound was a blow to Elias's heart, a cruel reminder of his failure to protect those he loved. Elias rummaged through the rubble, searching for something, anything that could serve as shelter. He found a corner slightly less exposed to the wind, beneath what remained of an arch. With numb hands, he tried to clear away fallen stones to create a small refuge. But there was no firewood, not even a dry branch. The ground was frozen, covered by a thin layer of snow that turned to ice at the slightest touch. The hope that had driven him there began to wane, replaced by an icy dread. "Grandpa, Leo is so cold," Finn said, his voice choked. Leo's face was pale, his lips purplish. His eyes, once bright, were now glazed over, fixed on some distant point. Elias felt a lump in his throat. He had promised his wife he would protect the family. And now, here they were, on the brink of the abyss, in a castle that was more a tomb than a home. With each ragged breath from Leo, Elias felt the weight of death approaching, an icy embrace that seemed inevitable. The promise now felt like an unbearable burden. As darkness fell over the ruins, bringing with it a new wave of cold, Elias looked up at the grey sky. There were no stars, only heavy clouds that promised more snow. The mountain range, vast and merciless, seemed to swallow everything. Somewhere, perhaps not so distant, another soul fought against the same fury of the elements, an even more desperate battle. Far from there, but under the same relentless sky, an elderly woman dragged herself through the snow. Her name was Elara. Every step was agony, every breath an effort. Her white hair was matted and covered with ice, her face etched with deep wrinkles, but her eyes, though weary, held a fierce determination. Within her womb, a new life stirred, a faint warmth that was the only thing preventing her from succumbing to the cold. She was a widow, alone, and pregnant, a late miracle or perhaps a curse in those desolate lands. The village, like Elias's, had rejected her. An old pregnant woman was seen as an omen, a burden, an aberration. Expelled to the mountain range, Elara walked aimlessly, guided only by the instinct to protect the child she carried. Her food reserves had run out days ago. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, but the cold was the cruelest enemy, threatening to freeze the life within her. Contractions began to manifest, weak at first, but increasingly frequent, a brutal reminder that time was running out. She stumbled on an exposed root, falling to her knees in the snow. A sharp pain pierced her belly, and she let out a groan. The baby moved, a gentle kick, as if reminding her of its existence, of her promise. Ilara stood up, her determination renewed. She couldn't give up. Not now. With each contraction, fear mingled with pain. But the image of her child in her arms gave her strength. The dense fog, clinging to the slopes, began to dissipate slightly, revealing an indistinct silhouette in the distance. A small structure, almost swallowed by vegetation and snow. A cabin, abandoned, decrepit, but a cabin. A spark of hope ignited in Ilara's heart, a fragile flame against the growing despair. There might be shelter, perhaps even a remnant of firewood, something to light a fire and ward off the death that pursued her. With her last strength, she dragged herself towards the cabin. The walls were of dark, aged wood, the roof partially collapsed. The door, hanging by a single hinge, stood ajar, inviting her into the unknown. The icy wind still blew, but as she approached, Ilara swore she felt a faint, almost imperceptible current of warm air emanating from the dark opening, an illusion of her exhausted mind, or a sign. With her heart pounding in her chest, more from exhaustion than fear, Ilara pushed the door. The creak was muffled by the howling wind. The interior was dark, but not as cold as outside, and then her eyes adjusted to the gloom. In the center of the single room, where a common fireplace should have been, there was something different, something that glowed with a soft, bluish light. A flame that danced without wood, without smoke, radiating a warmth that seemed to defy the laws of nature. The hearth of eternal fire. She had found it, and with it, perhaps, salvation for herself and her child. The sight of the blue flame dancing without wood, without smoke, was a balm to Ilara's exhausted soul. It was no illusion. The warmth, once just a whisper on the breeze, now radiated, filling the small space of the cabin with a promise of life. A warmth that didn't burn, but embraced, penetrating her damp clothes and icy bones. Ilara, with her last strength, dragged herself closer, feeling the stiffness of her body yield as the icy energy dissipated. The pain of contractions, which had torn at her before, began to diminish, replaced by a feeling of deep relaxation. The baby in her womb, which had thrashed in despair, now seemed to nestle, enveloped by that warm, protective aura. Ilara extended her trembling hand towards the flame, expecting a burn, but found only a warm, gentle breeze, like the breath of a living being. It was a warmth that seemed to come from within, not from external combustion. She sat, leaning against the stone wall of the hearth, closing her eyes and absorbing every particle of that miracle. The cold that had pursued her for days, threatening to steal her child and her very life, retreated, expelled by the gentle force of the blue flame. A wave of dizziness washed over her, not from weakness, but from a strange, revitalizing energy. It was as if every cell of her body, frozen and aged by time and ordeal, was awakening. When she opened her eyes again, the gloom of the cabin seemed less oppressive. The bluish light of the hearth illuminated the room, revealing the dark wooden walls, the low ceiling, and the packed dirt floor. It was simple, rustic, but at that moment it was a sanctuary. Ilara touched her own face. Her hands, once dry and wrinkled, felt softer, her skin less taut. The swelling in her feet and hands visibly diminished. It was impossible, and yet it was real. The dry cough that had plagued her for weeks disappeared. Her breathing became deeper and easier. The chronic fatigue that weighed on her shoulders like a lead cloak began to dissipate. She felt a different kind of hunger, not the searing pain of deprivation, but a healthy need, a desire to nourish her reborn body. The baby, once a source of pain and worry, was now a center of warmth and life in her womb, strong and serene. The blue flame seemed to pulse with a life of its own, a silent heart offering healing and renewal. Ilara looked at her hands again. The deep wrinkles, marks of a life of labor and suffering, seemed to soften, her age spots lightening. Her white hair, once matted and dull, gained a silvery sheen, and she swore she felt a slight wave, as if vitality were returning to the roots. The fear that had been her constant companion didn't completely disappear, but transformed. Now it wasn't the fear of imminent death, but the fear of losing what she had found. That secret, that source of life, was too precious to be revealed, too dangerous to be shared. The world outside, cruel and merciless, wouldn't understand. It would only covet it, destroy it. She stood up, feeling a strength she hadn't possessed in decades. Her knees didn't ache. Her back didn't protest. She walked to the small window, covered in cobwebs and dust, and tried to peer outside. The fog still lingered, but the air inside the cabin was thick with the promise of life. The mountain range, once an icy prison, was now a veil concealing her miracle. Ilara touched her belly, feeling the baby move with a new energy. No longer a desperate kick, but a gentle stretch, a sign of comfort and growth. The hearth of eternal fire not only warmed her, not only healed her old age, but nourished the life within her, protecting it from the world's harshness. It was a gift, a second chance, a rebirth. But with such power came immense responsibility and an even greater solitude. She was alone with her miracle, and the world outside, the same world that had rejected her, could never know. The tension was no longer the cold, but the weight of the secret, the fragility of her new existence. The weight of the secret. It was a burden heavier than snow, colder than the wind howling outside. Ilara touched her belly again, feeling the pulse of life that the hearth of eternal fire nourished. It wasn't just warmth, it wasn't just healing. It was a transformation that defied nature itself, and the world she knew was not ready for such a miracle. Fear, once an icy companion, now took a new form, the dread of discovery. She approached the blue flame, extending her hands. Her skin, once a tapestry of wrinkles and spots, was now smooth, almost translucent under the ethereal light. The knots in her fingers, which had tormented her for years, had diminished, and strength returned to her muscles, once atrophied by age and exhaustion. It was as if time had reversed, not just to heal, but to rewrite. Her hair, which moments before had been a dull tangle of white strands, now fell over her shoulders with a silvery sheen, and she could feel vitality pulsing in her scalp. The blurry vision that had accompanied her for years had dissipated, and the lines and cracks on the cabin walls, once indistinct, were now sharp, revealing the age and abandonment of the place. Ilara sought a reflection. There was a small puddle of water on the packed dirt floor, the result of some ancient leak. She knelt, the movement fluid and painless. What she saw there was not the old Ilara the mountain had tried to swallow. It was a younger woman, perhaps in her 40s, with the blue eyes of her youth now clearer, more alert. The deep wrinkles had softened, the lines of expression becoming marks of wisdom, not weariness. The figure staring back from the puddle was strong, resilient, and, to her surprise, beautiful. A tear ran down her face, not of sadness, but of silent awe. The baby in her womb moved again, a lazy stretch, a constant reminder of the life she carried and which now flourished under the flame's protection. The contractions had ceased completely. The weariness that had dragged her towards death had been replaced by a vibrant energy, a desire to live, to protect, to nourish. Hunger, though present, was no longer the searing pain of starvation, but a healthy call from her reborn body. The cabin, once a decrepit refuge, now felt like a protective womb, warmed and illuminated by the blue flame. Ilara stood up, feeling the firmness of the ground beneath her feet. She examined the small space. There was a crude wooden table, covered with a thin layer of dust, and a bench leaning against the wall. In the corner opposite the hearth, a pile of old rags, perhaps an improvised mattress. Nothing else. No clue as to who had built the cabin or about the origin of the eternal flame. It was a mystery, a gift without explanation, and perhaps it was better that way. The memory of the villagers, of their scornful glances and cruel words, returned with renewed force. An old pregnant woman, an omen of misfortune. Drive her out before the curse falls upon us. The voices echoed in her mind, reinforcing the conviction that her secret could never be revealed. The world outside, with its ignorance and fear, would destroy the flame, the cabin, and herself if it knew. This sanctuary, this new life, was hers to protect at all costs. But protection brought with it an even deeper solitude. She was alone, with a miracle no one else could comprehend. The howling wind outside seemed more distant now, muffled by the wooden wall and the warm aura of the flame. Yet the sound of the mountain range, merciless and vast, was still a reminder that the cabin was just a small point of light in a sea of darkness and danger. Ilara sat on the floor, closer to the hearth, feeling the warmth penetrate every fiber of her being. She closed her eyes, allowing the blue energy to envelop her. The baby stirred again, a movement that was now one of contentment, not despair. It was a miracle, yes, but also a burden. How would she feed herself and the baby? The flame warmed and healed, but it did not provide sustenance. The mountain range, though now less threatening in terms of cold, was still a desert of resources. The tension shifted from cold to survival. She was stronger, younger, but still a woman alone, pregnant, in an isolated cabin. Hunting and gathering would be necessary, but the harsh winter offered little. She would need to be cunning, careful, invisible. With each passing day, the flame strengthened her, but also bound her to her secret, to her cabin, to her solitude. The world outside, with its dangers and needs, still awaited her. And somewhere, in the icy ruins of a castle, another family fought against death, unaware that a blue miracle danced so close, promising life and renewal. The mountain range held its secrets, and Ilara was now part of one of them, a secret that could change everything, or condemn her to an eternal existence of isolation. The howling of the wind outside, once a mournful lament, now seemed a distant whisper, muffled by the wooden wall and the warm aura of the flame. Far from there, in icy ruins, others fought against death, oblivious to the blue miracle dancing so close, promising life and renewal. But Ilara did not think of them. Her mind was focused on the present, on the extraordinary transformation that enveloped her. Every cell of her body vibrated with an energy she hadn't felt in decades. Her skin, once a tapestry of wrinkles and spots, now possessed the smooth resilience of youth. The knots in her fingers, which had tormented her for years, had diminished, and strength returned to her muscles, once atrophied by age and exhaustion. It was as if time had reversed, not just to heal, but to rewrite the history of her body. Her hair, which moments before had been a dull tangle of white strands, now fell over her shoulders with a silvery sheen, and she could feel vitality pulsing in her scalp. The blurry vision that had accompanied her for years had dissipated, and the lines and cracks on the cabin walls, once indistinct, were now sharp, revealing the age and abandonment of the place. Ilara stood up, feeling the firmness of the ground beneath her feet. She examined the small space. There was a crude wooden table, covered with a thin layer of dust, and a bench leaning against the wall. In the corner opposite the hearth, a pile of old rags, perhaps an improvised mattress, nothing else. No clue as to who had built the cabin or about the origin of the eternal flame. It was a mystery, a gift without explanation, and perhaps it was better that way. Hunger, once a distant threat, was now a palpable reality. The baby needed nourishment. She would need to go out. The idea of leaving the cabin's safety, even for a short time, sent a shiver through her. The mountain range was treacherous, and the snow, though less lethal now that her body was warm, still hid traps. But the life growing within her was her priority. Ilara stood up, her eyes sweeping the cabin in search of anything useful. A piece of cloth to tie her hair, perhaps. A knife, if there was one. Nothing. She was as destitute as before, but now with renewed strength and determination. The fear of death had been replaced by the fear of failing her child. She walked to the door, hesitating. The scent of pine and fresh snow, mixed with the icy air, filtered through the cracks. The sun had not yet shown itself through the persistent fog. It was a grey, silent world, waiting. Ilara touched her belly, feeling the baby nestle. She was no longer the frail old woman. She was a mother, a guardian of a secret, and a survivor. The mountain range had tried to steal her life, but the blue flame had returned it, stronger than ever. Now she would face the mountain range again, not to die, but to live, to protect the life she carried. The hunt awaited, survival called, and the secret, more precious than any treasure, would remain hidden in her blue sanctuary. The icy mountain air, once a deadly kiss, was now an invigorating slap. Ilara opened the cabin door, and the grey, silent world revealed itself in all its vastness. The snow, deep and untouched, covered everything like a funerary shroud, stretching as far as the eye could see, punctuated only by dark, heavy pines. The sun, still hidden by a curtain of low clouds, cast a diffuse, heatless light, making the landscape even more desolate. She took a deep breath, and the biting cold filled her lungs, but it didn't make her shiver. The blue flame, invisible now, pulsed within her, an internal furnace that defied winter. Her muscles, once stiff and aching, flexed with surprising agility as she descended the two small, rotten wooden steps. Each step in the soft snow was firm, without the exhausted drag of before. Her old boots, which once felt like lead on her swollen feet, were now just a light weight, and she felt the ground beneath the snow, the uneven texture, the subtle incline. Her blue eyes, now clear and penetrating, swept the landscape. She searched for signs, for any hint of life that could sustain hers and the baby's. The mountain range was a white desert, but Ilara knew that life persisted, hidden, camouflaged. She remembered her father's stories. A skilled hunter before age overtook him about how to read the snow, how to follow almost invisible tracks, how to find small pockets of life amidst the desolation. Hunger, though no longer the excruciating pain of starvation, was a constant reminder. The baby, sheltered and warm, needed more than just the miracle of the flame. It needed food, substance. Ilara touched her belly, feeling the life there, a reminder of her new responsibility, her new strength. She was no longer the old woman awaiting death. She was a huntress, a provider, a guardian. She began to walk, moving away from the cabin, but keeping it always in her peripheral vision. The hearth, her sanctuary, was her reference point, her lighthouse amidst the snow and ice storm. She moved with caution, her ears sharp for the slightest sound, the rustle of a wing, the snap of a branch under the weight of snow, the whisper of the wind through the pines. The mountain range was treacherous, full of hidden abysses and wild animals that, hungry like her, would not hesitate to attack. Hours passed, and the landscape seemed unchanged. The snow was relentless, and the absence of tracks was disheartening. No rabbit, no hare, not even a small bird that might have left a mark. The mountain range seemed to have emptied itself, as if life itself had fled the rigor of winter. Despair threatened to seep in, a cold shadow that the internal flame could not completely dispel. Solitude weighed heavily, and the vastness of the mountain range seemed to mock her small hope. But then, a glimpse. Near a cluster of moss-covered rocks, where the snow was a little thinner, she saw it. Small green leaves, almost imperceptible, sprouting beneath a thin layer of ice. Winter herbs, tough and bitter but edible. It wasn't much, just enough for a handful, but it was a start, a sign that life indeed persisted. Ilara knelt, her agile, strong fingers easily breaking the ice. She carefully gathered the herbs, feeling their rough texture and earthy scent. It was a small victory, a reminder that the mountain range, though merciless, also offered its gifts. If one knew where to look, but it wasn't enough. The baby needed more. She needed more. She continued, following a rocky ridge that offered a slightly higher vantage point. From there, she could see the expanse of the forest, trees stretching like skeletal fingers towards the grey sky. And then, she saw it. Far below, in the valley, a dark patch that wasn't a tree. It looked like a shelter, a structure, a cabin perhaps, or the ruins of something larger. A wave of caution hit her. The mountain range was her secret, her refuge. Other humans meant danger, the threat of discovery, the flame, the miracle, the new life. Everything could be stolen, destroyed. But curiosity and necessity were powerful. There might be resources there, something to help her survive. She pondered, her heart beating harder in her chest. The path there would be long and dangerous, and the risk of encountering someone was real, but the baby's hunger was an imperative that outweighed fear. She had to try. The cabin, her blue sanctuary, seemed even more distant now, a point of light in a sea of uncertainties. Ilara clutched the herbs in her hand, their bitter scent, a reminder of her determination. She was no longer a victim, she was a mother, and she would do whatever it took to protect her child, even if it meant venturing deeper into the icy heart of the mountain range. The secret of the eternal flame strengthened her, but also pushed her into an isolation that became increasingly dangerous. Survival demanded risks, and Ilara was ready to pay them. The dark patch in the valley, once a distant promise, now became an urgent question mark on the vast white canvas of the mountain range. Ilara clutched the gathered herbs, their bitter, earthy scent an anchor for her determination. The cabin, her blue sanctuary, seemed an increasingly distant point of light, a beacon she was leaving behind in her search for life. The fear of discovery, of the desecration of her miracle, fought against the imperative need to nourish the life growing within her. And life won. With a sigh that was not of weariness, but of grim acceptance, Ilara began her descent. The rocky ridge, which had once offered a panoramic view, now transformed into a treacherous path, covered by a thin layer of ice beneath the soft snow. Every step was calculated, her blue eyes sharpened by the flame, sweeping the terrain in search of footholds, firm stones, dry branches that could serve as leverage. The mountain range, though no longer a threat of freezing, was still a labyrinth of hidden dangers, deep crevices masked by snow, loose rocks ready to collapse, the oppressive silence that amplified the slightest noise, turning the snap of a branch into a shotgun blast. Her body, now an instrument of strength and agility, responded with an efficiency the old Ilara would never have dreamed of. Her muscles, once atrophied by age, flexed with ease, and her balance was almost instinctive. She felt the earth beneath the snow, the incline, the dampness, as if she were connected to the mountain itself. But her mind, her mind still carried the weight of her humanity, of her fears and her solitude. The baby stirred again, a pulsating reminder of her mission, her vulnerability, and the courage she needed to summon. Hours dragged on, and the sun, which for a brief moment had threatened to appear, retreated again, leaving the landscape in perpetual grey. The air, once merely icy, now carried a different scent, subtle but perceptible to her sharpened senses. Smoke, not the sweet smoke of burning wood, but an older, more mineral scent like heated stone. Ilara's heart quickened. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant people. She moved with even greater caution, each step a whisper in the snow. The structure in the valley began to take shape, revealing itself not as a cabin, but as the ruins of an old watchtower, or perhaps a small abandoned mining post. The rough stone walls were partially collapsed, and the roof, if it had ever existed, had long since disappeared. But there was something more, a small improvised shelter made of old tarps and branches leaned against the most intact wall of the ruin, and from the gap between the tarps a thin wisp of smoke rose, almost invisible against the grey sky. Someone was there, or had been there very recently. Tension tightened Ilara's chest. She crouched behind a snow-covered pine, observing. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant howl of the wind. There was no movement, no sound of a voice, no sign of life, but the smell of smoke was undeniable. And warmth, a faint but perceptible warmth, emanated from the shelter. Curiosity and necessity fought against the instinct of self-preservation. If someone was there, she would be in danger. Her secret would be in danger. But what if no one was there? What if the fire was abandoned and there was food, supplies? The baby stirred again, a silent reminder of her hunger. Ilara waited motionless for what seemed an eternity. The sun began its slow descent, tinging the horizon with pale shades of orange and purple before being swallowed by the clouds. Darkness approached, and with it, the dangers of night in the mountain range. She couldn't wait forever. With a firm decision, she began to move again, circling the ruin, keeping to the shadows of the pines. Her feet barely made a sound in the snow. She approached the makeshift shelter, her heart beating like a drum in her ears. The tarp was torn in several places, and through one of the gaps she could see inside. It wasn't an ordinary fire. There was no wood. In the center of the small shelter, on a bed of dark stones, there was an ember that was not red, but a deep, almost indigo blue, pulsing with a soft light and undeniable warmth. It was a flame, but not a consuming flame. It was a flame that existed. Ilara's eyes widened. Another blue flame? It couldn't be. Was her miracle not unique? The shock paralyzed her for a moment. The flame in her cabin was unique, her most precious secret. But there, before her, was another, smaller, weaker, but undeniably the same color, the same essence. And then she saw it. Beside the blue ember, there was a small clay pot, half full of a dark, steaming liquid, and scattered on the ground some gnawed bones and what looked like a piece of dried meat. There was food, and someone had been there, someone who knew the secret of the blue flame. A shiver ran down her spine, not from cold, but from a primal fear. She was not alone in the mountain range. There was another, or others, who shared her secret, or at least knew of the existence of these mysterious flames. This changed everything. Her sanctuary was not as safe as she thought. Her miracle was not so exclusive. Ilara retreated slowly, her eyes fixed on the blue ember. The baby's hunger was still an imperative, but now there was a new fear, a new threat. Who was this person? What did they want? And what would happen if they discovered the flame in her cabin, the flame that healed her, that rejuvenated her, that warmed her child? She needed food, yes, but she needed answers even more, and protection. The world outside, with its ignorance and fear, was dangerous, but the world here in the mountain range, with its shared secrets, was even more so. The darkness of night deepened, and Ilara felt the weight of a new and terrible truth. She was not the only guardian, and this made her pray. The shiver that ran down Ilara's spine was not from the biting cold of the mountain range, but from an icy truth that had settled in her chest. Another blue flame, another guardian, or perhaps an explorer, her sanctuary, her miracle, her new life. Everything she believed to be unique and untouchable now seemed fragile, exposed. She retreated, not running, but sliding like a shadow, the snow barely whispering beneath her feet. Her eyes, once fixed on the indigo ember, now swept the growing darkness, every shadow a threat, every snap of a branch a warning. Who was there? Why was the flame smaller, weaker? Was it a fragment, a copy, or just a different manifestation of the same power? Ilara's mind spun in a whirlwind. The solitude of the mountain range, once a protective cloak, now revealed itself as an illusion. She was not alone. And the implication of that was terrifying. The outside world, with its greed and ignorance, was a known threat. But another human being, here in this frozen wilderness, who knew the secret of the blue flames, was a threat of a completely different order. It could be someone who would hunt her, who would try to steal her power, her youth, her baby, or worse, someone who would understand her, who would share her burden, but who would still pose a danger to her isolation. The baby stirred again, a pulsating reminder of the hunger that had driven her there. The food, the steaming clay pot, the dried meat, the gnawed bones. It was a promise of sustenance, a chance to nourish the life growing within her. But at what price? The risk of being discovered, of revealing her own existence, her own miracle. The scales of survival tipped dangerously. Hunger was a relentless enemy, but the fear of the unknown was an even more cunning predator. Ilara hid behind a snow-covered rock, observing the makeshift shelter. The blue smoke, almost invisible, continued to rise. The silence was oppressive, but now seemed charged with expectation, as if the entire mountain range was holding its breath. She needed the food. The baby needed it. There was no choice. But she couldn't be reckless. Cunning, stealth would be her weapons. With a cold and calculated decision, Ilara began to plan. The darkness of night was her ally. The wind, which began to howl again, would mask any sound. She would wait. Wait until night was at its peak, until visibility was almost zero, until the cold became an impenetrable veil. She needed every advantage. Hours dragged like centuries. The sun set completely, plunging the mountain range into near total darkness, broken only by the pale gleam of snow under the faint light of stars beginning to appear between the clouds. The wind picked up, whipping flakes of snow and ice, creating a ghostly chorus that echoed through the valleys. Ilara felt the cold, but her body, strengthened by the flame, endured it with impressive resilience. Her senses, sharpened by new vitality, were on high alert. Every fiber of her being was focused on the task ahead. She decided it was time. The shelter seemed deserted, the blue ember pulsing solitarily. There was no sound, no movement, but Ilara's caution was absolute. She moved, not in a straight line, but in a wide arc, using the shadows of rocks and pines for cover. Her feet, now light and agile, barely left marks in the snow. She approached the shelter, her heart pounding but under control. The smell of smoke and cooked meat was stronger now, a tempting and dangerous invitation. Reaching the torn tarp, she hesitated for a second, her eyes sweeping the interior. The blue ember was the only source of light, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. The clay pot was there, and beside it, a small leather pouch, which she hadn't noticed before, seemed to contain more dried meat. A small hunting knife rested beside the bones. With quick, precise movements, Ilara reached out. Her fingers wrapped around the clay pot, still warm, and she pulled it out. Next, she picked up the leather pouch, feeling the weight of the dried meat. She resisted the temptation to take the knife. Taking the knife would be a clear sign of theft, a challenge. She only wanted food. Necessity, not aggression, was her motivation. The instant her fingers closed over the pouch, a sound, a dry snap, like a branch breaking underfoot. Ilara froze, her body tense, her muscles ready for flight. Her eyes swept the surrounding darkness. Nothing. Only the howling wind and falling snow. It was just the wind, she tried to convince herself, or paranoia, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. A cold that didn't come from the air, but from a premonition. Without losing another second, she turned and began to retreat, as silently as she had arrived. The pot and the leather pouch were clutched firmly in her hands. Each step was a silent prayer not to be seen, not to be heard. The way back seemed longer, more treacherous. In every shadow she imagined a lurking figure. In every howl of the wind, a call, a warning. She didn't stop until the ruin was just a dark, distant smudge on the landscape. Only then did she allow herself a sigh of relief, a warm breath that dissipated into the icy air. The food was safe. But the safety of her own sanctuary, of her secret, was no longer guaranteed. The pot in her hands was a trophy, but also a bitter reminder that the mountain range was no longer her exclusive refuge. When she finally reached the entrance of her cabin, exhaustion and tension hit her hard. The soft warmth of the blue flame enveloped her like an embrace, a balm for her tormented soul. She knelt before it, feeling the healing energy, the warmth that nourished not only her body, but also the baby in her womb. The flame, her miracle, seemed even more precious now, more vital. She opened the leather pouch, revealing pieces of dark, fibrous meat. The smell was strong, wild, but promised sustenance. With the herbs gathered earlier, she would have a meal. The baby stirred, as if it knew the food had arrived. Ilara felt a pang of guilt for having risked so much, but necessity was imperative. As she ate, the dried meat and bitter herbs filling the void in her stomach, her eyes were fixed on the blue flame. She was not unique. There were others, and this changed everything. The mountain range, once a place of isolation and renewal, now became a chessboard where every move had to be calculated. Who was the other player, friend or foe? And what would they do if they discovered the power of her flame, the flame that transformed her, that rejuvenated her, that made her a mother again? Night advanced, but sleep would not come easily. Ilara lay near the hearth, the warmth comforting, but her mind alert. The image of the blue ember in the distant ruin, the feeling of invisible eyes, the threat of a shared secret, all of it mingled in a mosaic of fear and uncertainty. She had survived the cold, hunger, and old age. But now, a new challenge presented itself. She was no longer the sole guardian, and this made her pray. The mountain range had revealed a new mystery, and Ilara knew she needed to unravel it before it unraveled her. The mountain range had revealed a new mystery, and Ilara knew she needed to unravel it before it unraveled her. Night dragged on, but sleep was a luxury her agitated mind could not afford. Lying near the blue flame, its warmth pulsing through her body, she felt the baby stir in her womb, a constant reminder of the life she now protected with renewed ferocity. The dried meat, though satisfying, did not calm the storm in her soul. Her eyes, once weary and marked by time, now shone with an intensity that reflected the youth the flame had given her, but also a new and terrible concern. Who was this person? A lost wanderer, a hermit, or someone who, like her, had stumbled upon the miracle of the blue flames? The ember in the ruin was smaller, more contained, almost as if it were a diluted version of the power radiating from her own hearth. Did this mean the flame in her cabin was more potent, older, or simply that the other person didn't know how to extract its full potential? The uncertainty was a slow poison, corroding her newfound peace. She stood up, the agility of her movements a silent testament to her transformation. She walked around the cabin, touching the wooden walls, the few objects she had found and repaired. This was her sanctuary, her refuge, and now it was under threat. Solitude, once a blessing, now seemed a vulnerability. There was no one to ask for help, no one to share the burden, no one to defend her secret. It was just her and the baby against the unknown. Ilara's mind, sharpened by youth and necessity, began to plot scenarios. If the other person was hostile, what would they do? Would they try to steal her flame, her youth, her child? The idea that someone might want the baby, not out of love, but for the power it represented, sent an icy shiver down her spine. The baby was the living manifestation of the miracle, irrefutable proof that the blue flame not only healed, but also created. And what if the other person was like her, a lost soul seeking refuge, warmth, and healing? Compassion was a dangerous sentiment in times like these, but Ilara couldn't completely ignore it. She herself had been an outsider, desperate for salvation. But the presence of gnawed bones and the hunting knife in the ruin suggested a wilder, more primitive existence than her own. There was a fundamental difference between the search for sustenance and the mark of a life that seemed to have embraced the brutality of the mountain range. Dawn broke, bringing with it a pale, cold light, but Ilara had not slept. Instead, she had used the hours of darkness to observe, to think, to plan. The first thing was safety. She needed to fortify her cabin, make it less accessible, less visible. The windows, once openings to the world, now seemed weak points. She needed to cover them, perhaps with furs or planks, so that the blue light of her hearth would not be seen from outside. Next, observation. She couldn't simply wait for danger to come to her. She needed to understand who the other was, what their habits were, their intentions. This meant returning to the ruin, but with even greater caution, perhaps under the protection of daylight. When shadows couldn't hide as much, she needed information. The baby stirred again, and Ilara soothed it with a gentle touch to her belly. "Don't worry, my little one," she whispered, her voice firm despite the fear. "Mama will protect you, always." The promise was an oath, etched in her heart. She spent the morning gathering dry branches and stones, not for the hearth, but to create a kind of improvised barricade around the cabin. It wouldn't be impenetrable, but it would serve as a warning, an obstacle. She also looked for herbs and plants that might have healing or, if necessary, defensive properties. The mountain range was an open book of resources, and she needed to learn to read it quickly. By midday, with the weak sun filtering through the clouds, Ilara felt a growing urgency. The waiting was unbearable. She needed to act. With the empty clay pot and the leather pouch hanging from her waist, she decided it was time to return to the ruin, not to steal again, but to observe, to learn. This time, she would take with her a small stone knife she had patiently carved, an instrument of survival, not aggression, but one that offered a small measure of safety. She moved with the same stealth as the night before, her senses sharpened, every step calculated. The snow, now more compact from the day's slight thaw, crunched less beneath her feet. The wind had died down, and the silence of the mountain range was almost absolute, broken only by the occasional caw of a distant raven. The ruin came into view, a dark scar on the white landscape. Ilara hid behind a cluster of pines, her eyes fixed on the makeshift shelter. The blue smoke still rose, faint, almost invisible against the pale sky, but something was different. The torn tarp covering the entrance was now more closed, as if someone had tried to seal the interior, and more disturbingly, there were fresh boot marks in the snow around the entrance. Large boot marks, and they weren't hers. Ilara's heart leapt. The person was there. or had been there very recently. The feeling of being watched, which she had felt the night before, was not paranoia. It was a cold, tangible truth. She was not alone, and the other was active, perhaps even waiting for her. The mountain range, once her refuge, was now a hunting ground, and she, with her miracle and her baby, was the prey. The tension in her chest was almost unbearable. She needed answers, yes. But now, the priority was survival and escape. The icy air seemed to solidify in her lungs. The boot marks, large, not hers. The tarp more closed. There was no more room for doubt, for paranoia. The mountain range was no longer her exclusive refuge. It was a hunting ground. And she, with her miracle and her baby, was the prey. Ilara's heart beat like a wild drum in her chest, a frantic rhythm that seemed to echo through the silent mountains. Adrenaline, both poison and elixir, coursed through her veins, sharpening every sense. What to do? Flee, run without looking back, return to the safety or illusion of it, of her cabin. Or risk it, try to understand the nature of the threat that now loomed over her. Ilara's mind, rejuvenated and sharpened by the blue flame, did not allow for the paralysis of fear. The instinct to protect the baby in her womb was stronger than any terror. She needed information. She needed to know who the other was. Was he inside? Had he left? The fresh boot marks suggested a very recent presence. The stone knife in her hand seemed a fragile toy against the imminence of danger, but it was her only companion, a reminder of her capacity to fight. With the caution of a predator, not prey, Ilara moved. Every step was calculated, every breath held. She crept from pine to pine, using the dense foliage as disguise. The silence of the mountain range, once comforting, was now oppressive. Every snap of a branch beneath her feet seemed like thunder. Her eyes swept the terrain, searching for any sign, any movement, any indication that she was not alone. When she was a few meters from the ruin, the smell hit her. It wasn't just the smell of smoke, but a stronger, more animalistic odor, a smell of burnt meat, of sweat, of something wild and primitive. And then she heard it, a muffled sound coming from inside the ruin, a low growl. No, something more human, a guttural murmur, almost a lament, followed by a dry crack. The sound sent an icy shiver down her spine. It wasn't a lost wanderer, it wasn't a hermit, it was something more. Brutal. Ilara hid behind a snow-covered rock, her body tense, her heart pounding. She peered through a gap. The torn tarp covering the entrance swayed slightly, revealing a dark slit. Through it, Ilara could see movement, a large, shapeless shadow, and the faint blue glow of the flame, smaller than hers, but undeniably present. The shadow moved again, and this time Ilara could distinguish a figure. It was a man, large, corpulent, with matted hair and a thick beard that covered much of his face. He was crouched near the flame, tinkering with something. His clothes were dark and dirty, made of animal skins, and in his hand, Ilara saw the metallic glint of a knife, much larger and sharper than hers. He wasn't simply warming his hands, he was working. A chill ran through Ilara. The man seemed to be cutting something, perhaps the meat she had seen before. But the way he moved, the contained ferocity in his gestures, was not that of someone merely seeking sustenance. There was an aura of savagery, of an existence on the fringes of civilization. And then he lifted his head. His eyes, even at a distance and in the gloom, seemed to fix directly on the spot where Ilara was hidden. It was an instant, a blink of an eye, but to Ilara it felt like an eternity. She froze, barely daring to breathe. Had he seen her? It was possible that his eyes, accustomed to the darkness of the ruin, had perceived the slightest movement, the smallest disturbance in the snowy landscape. The man remained motionless for a moment, his head tilted as if sniffing the air. Ilara felt the baby stir in her womb, a small reminder of the life she carried, of the life that was in danger. The instinct to protect exploded within her, stronger than ever. She couldn't risk it, couldn't be seen, couldn't be caught. With the same stealth with which she had arrived, Elara began to retreat. Slowly, one step at a time, without making the slightest sound. Her eyes were fixed on the ruin, waiting for the man to emerge, to see her, to pursue her. Every muscle in her body was tense, ready for flight. She felt the cold of the snow through her boots, the biting wind on her face. But the only thing that mattered was distance, safety. She didn't look back until she was once again among the pines, a safe distance from the ruin. Only then did she allow herself a sigh, a warm breath that dissipated into the icy air. He hadn't followed her. Or at least he hadn't followed her openly. But the feeling of being watched, which had been a premonition the night before, was now a cold, terrible certainty. The air inside the cabin was a warm embrace, a stark contrast to the icy cold of the mountain range and the terror that still gripped her. Elara collapsed onto the packed dirt floor, exhausted, her heart still pounding against her ribs. The blue flame, her silent miracle, danced softly in the hearth, casting welcoming shadows that for a brief moment seemed to push back the darkness she had encountered outside. But peace was a mirage. The image of the man, the knife in his hand, his eyes fixed in the direction of her hiding place, was seared into her mind. She placed her hand on her belly, feeling the baby stir. A vivid reminder of the life she carried, of the life that was now under imminent threat. It was no longer just the cold, hunger, or solitude. It was something more primitive, more dangerous, a predator, and she, with her miracle and her child, was the prey. Elara's mind, rejuvenated by the flame, began to work feverishly. Who was that man? A hermit, a hunter, a bandit? His wild appearance, his animal skin clothes, the way he moved and handled the knife, all screamed danger. And the smell, that scent of burnt meat, of sweat and something more primal, still lingered in her nostrils. He wasn't a lost wanderer seeking shelter. He lived there, or at least frequented the ruin with disturbing familiarity. But what disturbed her most was the blue flame. He also possessed it, or at least he used it. Was it the same flame? Did it have the same healing properties, the same eternal warmth? Or was it a weaker version, just an unusual fire he had found? The idea that her sanctuary, her source of life and rejuvenation, was not unique, was deeply unsettling. If he knew what the flame could do, what it had done for Elara, he would seek her out. He would hunt her. She dragged herself to the hearth, extending her hands towards the flame. The warmth emanating was not just physical. It was an energy that calmed her nerves, that infused strength into her muscles. She needed that strength now more than ever. The promise to the baby in her womb echoed in her heart. She would protect him at any cost. The makeshift barricade she had built that morning now seemed pathetically inadequate. Dry branches and stones would not deter a man of that size, with that contained ferocity. She needed more. She needed a plan. Night was falling rapidly, shadows lengthening and swallowing the faint daylight. Darkness would bring not only cold, but also invisibility, both for her and for her potential pursuer. She couldn't afford to wait. Elara began to inspect the cabin with new eyes, the eyes of a strategist. The walls were sturdy wood, but the door was the weak point. And the windows, though small, were vulnerable. She needed to reinforce every entry point. First, the door. She dragged a heavy log she used as a bench and propped it against the door, creating a rudimentary barrier. It wasn't perfect, but it would buy her time. Next, she piled stones and other heavy objects against the windows, blocking them as much as possible. The cabin would be dark, but safer. As she worked, her mind didn't stop. She needed weapons. The stone knife was a start, but she needed something more substantial. Her eyes fell on an old rusty axe leaning in a corner. probably left by the previous occupant. It was heavy, but with a little effort she could sharpen it, and there was the empty clay pot, which could be used to carry water or, in an emergency, as a projectile. The mountain range, which once seemed a refuge, now revealed itself as a battlefield, and she, with her miracle and her baby, was at its center. Solitude, once a blessing, was now a curse. There was no one to ask for help, no one to warn. She was alone, but not completely alone. The baby in her womb was her strength, her reason, and the blue flame, her silent guardian, was her hope. When the last light of day faded, Ilara sat near the hearth, the rusty axe in one hand, the stone knife in the other. The cabin was dark, save for the soft glow of the flame. Every creak of the wood, every whisper of the wind, seemed amplified in the silent night. She didn't know if the man had followed her, if he was out there lurking in the shadows, but she was ready, or at least as ready as she could be. The wait was torturous. She couldn't sleep, couldn't rest. Her senses were sharpened, every fiber of her being on high alert. The mountain range had revealed a new mystery, and Ilara knew she needed to unravel it before it unraveled her. The struggle for survival had just begun, and this time it was not against nature, but against a threat that carried the same spark of mystery that had saved her. Night dragged on, a heavy cloak of darkness and uncertainty over the cabin. Every second was an eternity, every creak of the old wood a thunderclap in her sharpened ears. Ilara sat, the heavy axe resting in her lap, the stone knife clutched firmly in her other hand. The blue flame danced in the hearth, the only source of light and warmth, a pulsating heart of hope and mystery at the center of that makeshift fortress. But even the flame's warmth could not ward off the cold that had settled in her soul. Her eyes, accustomed to the gloom, swept the dark corners of the cabin, searching for any shadow that might move, any indication that the threat had penetrated the fragile defenses. The wind howled outside, a ghostly lament that seemed to carry whispers and footsteps. She strained to listen, trying to discern between the natural sounds of the mountain range and the possible approach of the man. The silence, when it came, was even more terrifying, a void filled only by the frantic pounding of her own heart. The baby in her womb stirred again, a soft, urgent reminder of the life she was protecting. It was for him that she was there, armed, vigilant, defying the fear that threatened to paralyze her. The blue flame had given her a second chance, a miracle of rejuvenation and fertility. But now, that same flame had placed her in the path of an unknown danger, a predator who seemed to share her secret. Ilara's mind wouldn't stop working. Who was that man? Did he know what the flame could do? Did he use it to warm himself, to cook, or for something more? The image of the knife in his hands, the contained ferocity in his gestures, wouldn't leave her memory. He didn't seem like a man merely seeking shelter. He seemed like a man who dominated that environment, who lived on the fringes, perhaps even hunting. And what did he hunt? The possibility that he also possessed a blue flame, or that the ruin harbored a similar source, was what disturbed her most. If he knew the true power of the flame, the power to heal and rejuvenate, he would not hesitate to seek it. And if he knew that Ilara, a woman who had been old and was now pregnant, was the living proof of that power, she would become a target. The flame, her sanctuary, could become her undoing. She leaned forward, extending her hand to the flame, feeling the warmth that emanated. It wasn't just warmth, it was life, energy. It was what kept her strong, what nourished the baby. She couldn't lose it, couldn't allow it to fall into the hands of someone who might use it for dark purposes. The flame was pure, a gift from the mountain range, and Ilara felt a growing responsibility to protect it. Hours dragged on. The darkness outside seemed to deepen, the shadows inside the cabin dancing with the flame. Ilara tried to focus on the sounds of the night, separating the real from the imaginary. The rustle of leaves, the snap of a branch under the weight of snow, the distant howl of a wolf. Every sound made her hold her breath. Every silence left her on high alert. She felt like a trapped animal, her survival instincts sharper than ever. Suddenly, a sound. It wasn't the wind, nor an animal. It was a subtle creak coming from outside the cabin near the door. Ilara froze, her heart leaping in her chest, her muscles tensed, the axe in her hand feeling heavier, more real. She pressed her lips together, barely daring to breathe. The sound repeated, a light scratch, as if something was being dragged or tested against the wood. It was him. He was out there. The air in the cabin seemed to thicken, charged with palpable tension. Ilara didn't move, her eyes fixed on the door, where the makeshift barricade now seemed pathetically weak. She could feel his presence, a shadow lurking in the darkness, testing her defenses. The baby stirred again, a stronger movement this time, as if sensing the imminent danger. Ilara closed her eyes for an instant, taking a deep breath, seeking the strength the flame gave her. She was no longer the frail old woman who had found the cabin. The mountain range had transformed her, the flame had rejuvenated her. She was a mother, a protector, and she would fight. At any cost. The scratching stopped. A heavy silence fell over the cabin, more oppressive than before. Ilara waited, every nerve on alert. Had he left, or was he just waiting, observing, testing her patience? The uncertainty was torture. She knew she couldn't sleep, couldn't rest. The night was still long, and the struggle for survival had just gained a new and terrible chapter. The mountain range, once her refuge, was now a hunting ground, and she, with her miracle and her baby, was the prey. But Ilara would not be easy prey. She had the flame, and she had a reason to fight. The silence that followed the scratch at the door was heavier than any sound. It settled in the cabin like an invisible predator, suffocating the air, tightening Ilara's chest. He was out there. She knew it. She could feel his presence, a dark premonition seeping through the cracks in the wood, laden with that faint yet unmistakable smell of smoke and sweat. Her eyes, which had previously swept the dark corners of the cabin, were now fixed on the door, where the heavy log and piled stones seemed a cruel joke against a man's determination. Every creak of the old wood, every whisper of the wind outside was amplified, transformed into a potential threat. Ilara's heart beat erratically against her ribs, a frantic rhythm in the deep stillness. She barely dared to breathe, fearing that the slightest sound might betray her position, might invite a more direct assault. The axe, heavy and cold in her hands, was her only tangible companion in that silent nightmare. The stone knife, sharp and familiar, offered a lesser but real solace. The baby stirred again, a soft flutter, then a more pronounced kick. It was an anchor, a force that kept her tethered to reality amidst the terror that enveloped her. "I am here," Ilara whispered to herself. To him, her voice hoarse and almost inaudible. "I will protect you." The promise was an oath, seared into her soul, stronger than any fear. The blue flame danced in the hearth, oblivious to the drama unfolding around it, its soft light casting long, shifting shadows that played tricks on her eyes. It was a beacon, yes, but also a trap. If he had seen her, if he knew of her existence, then he knew she was there, and if he knew of its power. That thought was a slow poison, corroding her courage. He was not a wild animal attacking by instinct. He was a man, and men, with their intelligence and cruelty, were far more dangerous. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Had he left? Or was he just observing, waiting for her to make a mistake, to reveal herself? The psychological torment was almost unbearable. She imagined him out there, his eyes fixed on the cabin, his mind calculating, planning. He was in no hurry. He had all night. Then a new sound, Not a scratch, but a soft, rhythmic thud. It came from the side wall near one of the small windows she had barricaded, a muffled sound as if something was being pressed or gently struck against the wood. He was testing the defenses, looking for a weak point, a breach. Ilara turned slowly, her body tense, the axe raised, ready. She crept silently to the opposite wall, keeping to the shadows, her eyes fixed on the spot from which the sound came. The blue flame's glow, though faint, was enough to illuminate the silhouette of the window, now a dark mass of stones and branches. The sound stopped. Another silence. Once again, the weight. She could almost hear his breathing, feel the weight of his presence through the walls. He was toying with her, a predator with his prey. But Ilara was no ordinary prey. She had the eternal fire, the miracle that had transformed her, and she had a baby to protect. She thought of the knife he carried, of the ferocity in his eyes. He was not a man who retreated. He was a man who took what he wanted. And what did he want? The cabin? The warmth of the flame? Or something more? The idea that he might know about the rejuvenation, about the pregnancy, was absurd. But the mountain range was a place of mysteries, and the blue flame was the greatest of them. Suddenly, a loud, dry crack. The window wood gave way slightly, and a gap opened, revealing a glimpse of the darkness outside. A piece of the barricade had been removed, or perhaps pushed forcefully. A thread of icy air invaded the cabin, bringing with it the sharp scent of snow and damp earth. And once again, that smell of smoke and sweat. He was there, right there. Ilara recoiled a step, her heart pounding. She could see a dark shadow moving in the gap, an indistinct form against the night. He was trying to peer inside, trying to see if she was there, how she was. She gripped the axe, her knuckles white. "Who's there?" Ilara's voice came out as a hoarse whisper, yet charged with a strength she didn't know she possessed. It was a bluff, an attempt to show that she wasn't defenseless, that she was aware. The movement in the gap stopped. Silence returned, even denser, even more threatening. He didn't answer. He just waited. That silence was his weapon, his way of destabilizing her, of making her doubt. But Ilara would not doubt, not now. She had faced freezing to death, old age, the solitude of the mountain range. She had found a miracle and a new life. She would not surrender to a ghost in the darkness. She moved slowly, silently to the hearth. She picked up a dry branch she had saved for kindling, though the blue flame needed no wood. With a swift movement, she lit the tip of the branch in the eternal flame, creating a makeshift torch. The flickering light, though faint, was more than the darkness offered. With the torch in one hand and the axe in the other, Ilara approached the window. She couldn't let him see her, but she also couldn't remain passive. She needed an advantage, a response. She raised the torch, not to illuminate herself, but to cast its light through the gap, to the outside. The intention was clear, to surprise him, perhaps even blind him for an instant. The orange-bluish glow of the torch cut through the darkness, revealing for a brief, terrible second a pair of bright, wild eyes staring back at her through the gap. They were the eyes of a predator, filled with dark curiosity and disturbing intelligence. They were not the eyes of a lost man, they were the eyes of a hunter. The torch also illuminated a piece of his face, marked by time and life in the mountain range, and the metallic glint of something in his hand. It wasn't the knife, it was something larger, heavier, a piece of wood perhaps, or a tool. He recoiled quickly, his shadow disappearing from the gap, the sound of hurried footsteps in the snow, a rustling of bushes. He had moved away, for now. Ilara released the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her heart still pounded, but a wave of adrenaline coursed through her. She had reacted, she had defended herself, and he had retreated. She knew it wasn't the end. It was just a pause. He would return. Or perhaps he was just reassessing, changing tactics. The night was long, and the mountain range held many secrets. But Ilara had found her voice, her strength. She was no longer the helpless old woman. She was the guardian of the flame, the protector of a new life, and she was ready for the next round. The mountain range had given her a miracle and now demanded her courage in return. The air escaped Ilara's lungs in a trembling sigh, but not of relief. Adrenaline still coursed through her veins, an icy, burning river. He had retreated, yes, but the sense of his presence did not dissipate. It was as if the darkness outside had absorbed his form, but not his intent. The smell of smoke and sweat, once sharp, was now a persistent memory, permeating the icy air that entered through the window gap. Her eyes, still fixed on the dark opening, saw only the void of night, but her mind projected the image of those wild eyes, filled with a dark curiosity. He had not fled. He was merely regrouping, planning. With the makeshift torch still in hand, Ilara approached the window with caution. The flickering light danced over the damp wood and loose stones. She pushed the piece of wood that had given way, trying to fit it back into place. It wasn't enough. The barricade was compromised. With renewed effort, she dragged a few more stones and a smaller log, piling them against the gap, making it safer but not invulnerable. Every movement was a test for her muscles, every sound an alarm for her ears. The silence that followed was heavier than before, an oppressive cloak that stifled every sound except the frantic pounding of her own heart. Ilara extinguished the torch in the hearth, letting the blue flame be the only source of light and warmth. She couldn't afford to spend the few dry branches. The flame's light, though faint, was a beacon in her darkness, but also a revelation to anyone lurking outside. She was an illuminated target. She sat down again near the hearth, the axe resting in her lap, the stone knife in her hand. Her eyes swept the dark corners of the cabin, searching for any shadow that might move, any sound that might break the stillness. The baby stirred again, a soft movement, almost a caress. It was a reminder of her promise, of her reason to fight. She was no longer the frail old woman. She was a mother, a warrior. The mountain range had transformed her, and the flame had strengthened her. Minutes dragged like hours. The night's cold penetrated the cabin walls, but the warmth of the blue flame enveloped her, protecting her and the baby. She tried to calm her mind, seeking the clarity she needed. What did he want? The cabin, the warmth, or was there something more? Those eyes. They were not those of a man desperate for shelter. They were those of a man with a purpose, a hunter. Then, a new sound. Not a scratch, not a thud. It was a more subtle, more insidious sound, a light, persistent rustle coming from the roof, as if something was being scraped or perhaps very carefully removed. He was on the roof. That thought chilled Ilara's blood. The roof, made of old planks and moss, was a weak point she hadn't considered with the same urgency as the doors and windows. She stood up slowly, the axe raised, her eyes fixed on the dark ceiling. The sound continued, a slow, methodical rhythm, as if he knew exactly what he was doing. He was removing the planks, one by one, or perhaps the moss and earth that covered them, searching for an opening. He was in no hurry. He had all night, and she was trapped inside, a mouse in a trap. The baby stirred more forcefully, as if sensing the imminent danger from above. Ilara felt a wave of panic, but transformed it into fury. She would not allow it, not after everything she had been through, not after finding this miracle. She would not surrender. She looked at the blue flame, seeking not just warmth but inspiration. The hearth was the cabin's heart, the center of its power. If he tried to enter through the roof, he would be directly above her. It was a vulnerability, but also an opportunity. The rustling on the roof stopped for an instant, followed by a louder crack, as if a plank had been moved or broken. A thread of icy air descended from the ceiling, bringing with it the smell of damp earth and, once again, that odor of smoke and sweat. He was making progress. Soon, there would be an opening. Ilara retreated to the wall opposite the hearth, her eyes fixed on the spot from which the sound came. She couldn't climb onto the roof, she couldn't fight up there, but she could wait, she could prepare. She could use the cabin and the flame as her weapon. The tension was almost unbearable. She could feel his presence, the weight of his body above her, the sound of his breathing, muffled by the roof. He was there, so close, and yet invisible. It was a macabre dance in the darkness, a game of cat and mouse, where the prey had a miracle and the hunter and relentless determination. Ilara gripped the axe, her knuckles white. The mountain range had given her a miracle, and now demanded her courage in return. She would not be easy prey. She had the flame, and she had a reason to fight. And she would fight until her last breath, to protect the life growing within her, the future the blue flame had promised. The night was still long, and the battle for survival was only beginning to unfold in its most brutal and desperate form. The night was still long, and the battle for survival was only beginning to unfold in its most brutal and desperate form. The rustling on the roof intensified, no longer a subtle sound, but a violent scraping, followed by a loud, dry crack. A plank gave way, and a shower of moss, earth, and small debris fell, raising a cloud of dust in the cabin's thin air. A dark, irregular hole opened in the ceiling, revealing a patch of the starry night and, for an instant, the crouching silhouette of a man. Ilara didn't hesitate. Her body, rejuvenated by the eternal flame, moved with an agility she never imagined she possessed. The axe, heavy and cold in her hands, became an extension of her will. She was no longer the helpless old woman who had entered that cabin. She was a mother, a guardian, and the fury that drove her was as ancient and powerful as the mountain range itself. The man, a corpulent figure, hesitated for a second in the hole, his wild eyes searching for the light source. The blue flame of the hearth, once a beacon, was now an invitation to the trap Ilara had prepared. He dropped with a dull thud, landing on the packed dirt floor a few feet from the hearth. His face, scarred and bearded, was a mask of grim determination, and in his hand he wielded a thick piece of wood, almost a club. The smell of smoke and sweat, now intense, filled the small space. He didn't expect to find her there, not like that. The blue light of the hearth danced on his face, revealing the momentary surprise in his eyes. It was in that instant of hesitation that Ilara attacked. With a hoarse cry, more animal than human, she charged, the axe raised above her head. It wasn't a blow of precision, but of pure strength and desperation. The man tried to raise his club to defend himself, but Ilara's speed caught him off guard. The axe didn't hit his head, but grazed his shoulder, tearing the fabric of his jacket and the skin beneath. A grunt of pain escaped his lips, and he staggered back, hitting the wall. He was no amateur. His eyes, now filled with rage, fixed on Ilara. He recovered quickly, swinging the club in a wild arc. Ilara recoiled, feeling the wind of the blow pass close to her face. The impact of the club against the cabin wall made the old planks groan. The cabin was small, and the fight was claustrophobic. Ilara moved among the shadows, using the hearth as her reference point. The man, larger and stronger, tried to corner her. His eyes fixed on the blue glow of the flame. It was as if the flame both attracted and repelled him. "What do you want?" Ilara's voice was a low growl, almost inaudible above the man's ragged breathing. He didn't answer, just lunged again, the club in a horizontal swing. Ilara ducked, the axe scraping the floor, and counterattacked with a low blow, aiming for his legs. The man leaped back, avoiding the strike, but losing his balance for an instant. It was enough. Ilara, with a swift movement, threw the stone knife she held in her other hand. It wasn't to kill, but to distract. The knife struck his arm, a superficial cut, but enough to make him let out a roar of pain and fury. He staggered, the club falling from his hands. Ilara gave him no time to recover. She advanced again, not with the intention of fatally wounding, but of neutralizing. With a precise strike from the axe handle, she hit the side of his head. The man fell to his knees, dazed, his head spinning. He tried to get up, but Ilara was on him. She was no killer, but the protection of her baby and the flame made her relentless. She pushed the man away from the hearth, into the darkest corner of the cabin. He was groggy, but still conscious, his eyes blinking in the gloom. "You won't touch this cabin. You won't touch what's mine," Ilara whispered, her voice low and filled with a newfound authority. He stared at her, his eyes still wild, but now with a glint of defeat and perhaps understanding. He had underestimated the woman, the guardian of the flame. Ilara couldn't kill him, but she couldn't leave him free either. The night was still long, and the mountain range was relentless. She knew that by dawn he would have to make a choice: remain trapped and freeze, or cry for help and risk being found by other dangers of the mountain range. She stepped away, the axe still in her hands, and sat down again near the hearth, the warmth of the blue flame calming her nerves. The baby stirred within her, a gentle movement, as if responding to the cessation of danger. Ilara caressed her belly, feeling a wave of love and relief. The fight had been quick, brutal, but she had prevailed. The mountain range had given her a miracle, and now demanded her courage in return. And she had answered. The man trapped in the corner of the cabin gasped, but no longer tried to move. He merely watched the blue flame, his eyes fixed on it, as if he finally understood the sacred nature of that fire. Ilara knew that the peace she had won was fragile, but it was hers. She had faced freezing to death, old age, the solitude of the mountain range, and now the threat of a predator. She had found a miracle and a new life, and she was ready to protect them, no matter the cost. The night would drag on, but dawn would bring new hope. The blue flame would continue to burn, eternal, a beacon in the darkness, a symbol of life reborn. Ilara, the elderly pregnant widow, had transformed into the guardian of the flame, the mother of the mountain range, and her future and the future of her baby were safe, warmed by the promise of a fire that would never die. The cabin, once an abandoned refuge, was now a sanctuary, a home, the cradle of a new beginning.